You're listening to Every Day's a Saturday USMC Veteran Podcast.
Now introducing your host of Every Day's a Saturday USMC Veteran, the one-man show, Brian Roof.
What's going on, friends and family? Thank you guys so much for joining me on another great day, another great interview. And before we get started, I would like to say, if you guys haven't had a chance to go check out the website, go check out the website, EDASUSMCvet.com. That's where you'll be able to get caught up with all the different interviews, the different seasons we got going on. We got season 1 and season 2. And as well as we have nonprofit organizations on there, and we have veteran-owned businesses. So definitely something to go check out. And if you also want to get in contact with me, there's, the contact information if you would like to be a part of the show or anything like that. But I'm excited to have my next guest on. My next guest is a Navy veteran, an author, and we're going to get to listen and hear all about his story. And here he is to talk about it is Bill Cushing. What's going on?
Well, not much. Thanks for letting me jump in here.
Oh, well, I appreciate you wanted to jump in here. You know what I mean?
Hey.
All right. So, hey, let's get to know all about Bill Cushing. Hey, where did you grow up at, and what made you decide to join the Navy? What'd you end up doing in the Navy? All those great things.
Okay. Well, I come from a Navy family, actually. And this last book, that Heroic Brothers of the Civil War, one of the main characters, there's nonfiction, but is the guy I was named for, is William Barker Cushing, who was the commander who sank the Albemarle. He was not a commander at that point, but yeah, my dad was 28 years in. He was a captain on submarines, and I have to confess, I joined primarily because my draft number was so low. I figured, well, this is going back to 1969, when things were hot and heavy over in Vietnam,
right? And
it just made more sense to enlist and
than to be drafted.
It's something of a choice in where I went and what I did.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So I joined up in 70 and ended up, it's funny because I had intended to major in journalism. And when I got in the Navy, I figured, well, they have a journalism corps and I'll, go for that. And then in boot camp, when they give you the test, the battery of tests for your MOS, I sat down with the yeoman. I guess he was a second class, but some petty officer. And he says, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I want to be a journalist. And about 3 minutes later, after he got done laughing, he said, I don't need journalists. Okay. And I was like, okay, what do you want me to do? And he said, well, what I ended up becoming was an electrician's mate, which sort of made sense. My dad was an electronics engineer. I had worked for him over the summers in high school. So when I was good with my hands, I understood that stuff pretty well. Not terribly bad at math. That's not my strong point, but I can muddle through. So I ended up becoming an electrician's mate, and primarily on destroyers, destroyer escorts, they were called at the time. Then they became fast frigates. And I spent most of my time just chasing Soviet ships around the Caribbean, pretty much. We were docked out of Gitmo and just worked out of there for the most part. So, I was on a tender for a while. I was on an ammo ship for a while, but my first tour was on a destroyer that was a gearing class, if anybody remembers that name. Those were built in the 1940s and late 40s. And then I ended up becoming a plank owner on a brand new frigate. And that's where I ended up, before I got out. So, it was fairly uneventful. Luckily, I was very glad for that and didn't have half the tension that I'm sure a lot of guys went through.
No, but it sounds like you did a lot of time in the sea, man.
Yeah. Then, well, it's funny because after I got out, I continued working electrical work on mostly oil tankers, but also fishing boats and whatever. That was doing contract work, not being part of the crew, but just when they came in the yards for repairs or whatever. Sometimes I'd ride the ship to do some work, but I was not part of the crew itself. I was just there to do repairs or replacements or whatever.
So you never got seasick or nothing like that, I guess?
No, that's never been a big problem.
You had good sea legs, it sounds like.
I grew up sailing. I've been sailing since I was about 5.
Okay.
In fact, one of my fondest memories was, and my wife thought something was wrong with both my father and I with this one. But my dad had a good friend who had a 38-foot schooner, and we would always go out on that. And one of the things he used to do, and I'm probably 4, 5, 6 years old maybe, he would put me in a life jacket, tie a rope around the jacket, and then tether the other end to the mast, and just take me and heave me out into the water as far as he could throw me. And I just loved it. I would just,
Yes.
I was just, let's go again. Yeah, so I never had a problem with that. In fact, it's kind of funny. We went on an Alaskan cruise some years ago, my wife and our son, and I remember coming back from breakfast and telling her, I said, I think we're in for some rough seas today. And she goes, why is that? I said, well, they had the barf bags out in the public, the elevators and everything. So be prepared. And not that it got that bad, but, I'm sure for some people it was not much fun. But no, I never had a problem with that.
So now, have you been to a lot of different places and stuff like that?
Doing the work, yeah. I was from New York originally. That's pretty much, I was born in Norfolk, but my dad was stationed there at the time, but he was from New York. And so when he got out of active duty, he did the rest of his time reserves, moved back to New York. But I went to high school right outside Philly. In fact, it was, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Taps. Are you familiar with that movie at all?
Yeah, it's been a while, but yeah.
That was where I went to high school, was Valley Forge Military Academy, which is where they filmed that film. Then I got out and I started college, but didn't do very well the first time out. And was invited not to come back after my first semester.
So how many years did you spend in the Navy before you decided to go into college?
The 4 years.
Just the 4 years, yep.
Yeah, because what I did was when I flunked out of college, that was when I was, okay, I lost my deferment, got to do something. So, and it's funny, I actually had an offer for Canada. There was a guy my dad did business with, and he was in Montreal, and he told me, he says, hey, you want to come up here? I'll get you a job. And I was like, yeah, but I might want to return home once in a while. So I'll pass on that one. Although I do have to say he had 2 cute daughters. It was a tempting offer. But as soon as I flunked out, I said, okay, I just enlisted and went right in and then, got out later on and just, like I say, picked up from there and started working on the shipyards and stuff. So.
Yeah, you definitely had a calling for the ships, huh?
Oh yeah. And I still go out whenever I can. I used to sail out of Long Beach. Unfortunately, they closed that facility up, but they're down in San Diego now, so I can still go out of there and make a trip. And it's a sailing club that has very good prices. It was well worth it to me to stay with it.
Nice.
But,
now, being out at sea as much as you've been out there, you got any crazy sea stories, or has it been pretty?
It was pretty sedate. I think the thing that I enjoy telling people the most is that I don't know if you ever heard of the old Soviet salute, we called it back then. Whenever we came close to a ship that was under their flag, whoever wasn't on duty at the time, they would make an announcement over the PA that, port side Soviet salute, and everybody who was not on duty would get up there, and on command, we would all drop our trow and moon the Soviets. So,
you guys had a lot of close calls with them guys?
Not really. There were some
like
times,
they're always touting around in our air, in our sea.
They might
over
play
there.
chicken once in a while, but
yeah,
it was mostly They knew where we were. We knew where they were. We just chased each other around pretty much. It was much hairier in the North Atlantic, obviously, the closer you got to Russia. But yeah, where we were out of Norfolk and into the Caribbean and stuff, it wasn't too bad. I mean, everybody would show their muscles once in a while, but nothing really, not that bad. In fact, the thing I always remember hearing was one of the guys told me, because of course I was a snipe, and so I'm down below for the most part. I'm not up on deck. But the thing I always heard that kind of scared me, I was more afraid of Russian MiGs than I was of their ships. Because he said that, yeah, of course they always have a lookout, a physical lookout. He says, yeah, but the thing is, if you see a Soviet MiG coming at you by way of the lookout, you got about enough time to say a prayer. That's about it. Because if you can see them with the naked eye, they've already got their stuff on the way. There's not much going to do about it. So,
right.
So we were always on the lookout for the planes. Not so. The ships were pretty obvious. They can't stay hidden that well.
So let's talk kind of more about your job and kind of what you did and stuff while you were in. Like, talk more about detail what your responsibilities were.
Yeah, well, as an electrician, of course, power, distribution
for the ships and stuff like that. Yeah.
It was a lot of maintenance for the most part. There's one. I was just thinking of that. When I was on the tender. Well, two stories came off that one of them, my first day there. Our second class in the division was taking me and another guy around to show us around. And if you've ever been on a tender, or have you ever seen one, it's just a great big repair shop on the water. And we're walking through the machine shop, and there's this really nice pair of leather work gloves sitting right out in the open on the tool bench. And one of the guys, isn't somebody afraid? They says, nah, nobody will steal those gloves. I said, why not? He says, go try them on. Well, the guy who owned the gloves was missing 2 fingers on one hand and 1 finger on another, and he had those up. So unless you had the exact same hands as him, you weren't going to wear them. So it's like, yeah, he doesn't worry. And then the other thing, and this is one I always remember, was one here again. I first got out there, just right out of A school, basically. And the guy had me and another guy out there cleaning the batteries, which, when the corrosion builds up. Well, you start with just a flat iron, scraping the corrosion off. Well, the guy I was working with happened to drop his, and it went across the terminals and just started sparking like crazy. I don't think 2 guys had ever come flying out of that small a space so fast. And I had never seen it. But yeah, basically, my battle station was after steering, so I was just sort of there as a stopgap. If the bridge went out, I would help steer and that sort of thing. But of course, there again, the joke there is that, well, if you're in after steering, aren't you below the water line? It's like, oh yeah, you are. So, if anything happens to the ship, you're sort of dead meat anyway. So
yeah, my gosh.
But I enjoyed it. I was grateful for I got a good trade out of it, which translated into another 10, 12 years of work, before I went back to school. So
now you just wanted to be forward and done. No interest.
Once I was done, I said, yeah, it was fine for my dad. It's funny. In fact, I was nominated for the prep school at Annapolis, which, I was very honored with, but I started thinking, I said, well, first you got to go through the process, and then you got to, assuming you get qualified and you get accepted, you got a year of prep school, then 4 years of the academy, and then whatever I think the requirement was 5 years active, 8 total or something. I said, you're already up to 13, 14 years, and I'm really not that interested in staying around that long.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, it was just a side avenue to get rid of my obligation. And like I say, hey, I met some really great people, still stay in touch with several of them. And very grateful for the trade because, like I say, it fed me very well after I got out. So,
Yeah, that's great. Now, out of your 4 years, how often do you think you were actually out in sea out of those 4 years?
uh,
Great deal
well,
of it.
remember, tenders tend to stay locked up to the dock. So
Yeah.
that was really not sea duty. So probably 13 months.
No, that's not too
Yeah,
bad. Yeah,
before, yeah.
considering.
As you figure, all right, boot camp, A school. Then I was out for a little while. Well, maybe more than 13 if you consider the D'Amato, which is the first destroyer I was on. But the tender, here again, the joke was that they get welded to the pier pretty much.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I've only been on what was the Pearl Harbor, I think it was called.
Oh, the transport,
It,
LCS.
yeah, it was huge. It was
Yeah.
no, it was huge ship, and they had all the different decks painted different colors, so where
Oh,
where we were allowed to go. Like
yeah.
if it was red, the Marines were allowed to go on that. Blue, we were
Oh,
not allowed to go on at all.
oh, that's
And
interesting.
then I think green was neutral, like the Chow Hall. I think they
Yeah.
had the Chow Hall was the green deck, but yeah, it was kind of crazy living life out on sea.
Yeah.
And a lot of us got sick right off rip. You know,
Oh,
we're
yeah.
over here begging for Dramamine the whole time. Going to doc like, hey, bro.
Well, you would have loved destroyers. What's the line is, what is it? 1 over, 2 under. You go over one wave and you go under two.
Yeah, man.
But that's what they're built for. That's the whole point of the thing. It's just a
I
very,
didn't really know I was a seasick kind of person until I went out there, and then they made us all go to the bottom of the ship for formation.
oh God,
And
that's, yeah.
we're sitting at the bottom, and everybody's sitting in formation, and then next thing you know, you just see people
Yeah, heaving.
pulling to the side, and then that got in my mindset, and I'm like, oh boy, I'm screwed, dude. Now here I am feeling nasty, and so
Yeah.
yeah, this ship life is different.
Like I say, I've been sailing since I was a kid, so
Yeah, you were pretty much used to that whole
sailboats are
thing,
not the most stable things in the world either.
right? Yeah. Now, so after you got out of the Navy, you ended up, let's kind of talk more about your afterlife out of the Navy.
Yeah, I did a number of things. I mean, I drove cabs for a while. I did some bartending and that sort of stuff. But I started actually. It was funny because when I initially got out, I was out of Norfolk, and so I applied at Newport News at the the yards there. But it took a while to get that going. So I actually spent 3 days digging ditches, which was, man, the only nice thing about that job is it can't get any harder. It was it was brutal. And I think the third day I walked in, and it was funny because I was living with a friend of mine who was still on the ship, but he and his wife had a little bungalow out on Buckrow Beach in Hampton. And so I was living with them, and I came home that third day, and I just told this guy's wife, I said, I don't know if I can do this any longer. She goes, well, you're lucky. The yard's called. They want you in tomorrow morning to process, get your badge and all that. But at the same time, it was funny. While I was working at the yards, I started a job at nights bartending. And then one nice summer day, I woke up and the weather was beautiful. I decided, you know what? I'm making enough off the bartending job that I can just do that and have my days free.
Because you were probably getting tips and stuff too from all
Yeah,
them
yeah.
drunk
Oh, I
folks,
did,
man.
did
Once they
very
start
well.
getting slammed, man, they just
Yeah. But then, but then when I just went through a series of stuff and I ended up moving back to New York. And that's when I hooked up with this guy out of Brooklyn who had a electrical contracting company. And that was where I got on the oil tankers and worked on them, and probably worked with him for about probably a good 5 years. Here again, off and on, because it was contracting. So it was like sometimes you're working, sometimes you weren't. But in between, I would go get a job. I used to sell stereo equipment, stuff like that, just to fill in until he'd call, say, all right, we got to, because most of his contracts are like, all right, a year or so here. Like we spent a little over a year in Baltimore. Spent some time down the Virgin Islands, which was great.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Uh,
Yeah.
but but then what happened? It's kind of interesting because he moved the company down to Florida, down to Jacksonville, where we do most of the work. And when I was there, I met up with a woman she's quite a bit older than me. She's about 15 years older than I, but we got along very well. And she kept telling me, she says, "You got to go back to school, man. You love talking about books and you love history and, music and all this stuff. And you got to, And I kept going, I'm happy where I am. I like I always liked the electrical work. It was something where you're using your head and your hands at the same time. But then two big events occurred that convinced me maybe it was time to make a change. And one of them was a very good friend of mine on the job. He died on the job.
Mm.
And this guy was like the safest worker I knew. I was like, oh my God, if he can die at this, I sure as hell can.
Now he died due to an accident happened.
He had been sent to ride a ship and do some work on it. So the circuit was live.
Mm.
And I think what happened was the other guys who were with him said that the ship heaved and he fell into the board and just caused a heart attack.
Wow.
So I was like, and this guy, I was like, man, he wouldn't change a light bulb without, 3 ladders and a net. And I was like, and then I was working with our foreman on a 650 amp breaker box. And we got done and we were going to test the circuit out. And I said, well, let me go take a leak. And the ship was inoperable. I had to go off onto the docks and go to the men's room there. And I come back and I was going, what happened to Chris? And I was like, well, what do you mean? They said, well, they just took him off in an ambulance. And I go down to where we were working. Well, the thing had blown up and, he was in the hospital. But when I got there to see him, and he was burned pretty badly, but he told me, he says, if you had been there, you would have died. I was like, well, how come you didn't? He says, I'm the foreman. They give me a much better hard hat than they give you. And I was like, maybe a change of career wouldn't be a bad thing right about now.
Gosh.
So I worked a little bit longer, very carefully, and saved up some money. And then I picked up a job. I found a midnight shift as a building engineer for a retirement home and took that and then went back and started back at community college. And
I could imagine how hard it would be to work out and see, especially when you're trying to fix something and you're using your hands a lot. I get frustrated at things that don't move, right? Like I can imagine as you're sitting there on some choppy water and you got to fix this thing, and especially like that guy ends up, getting
I think
into it.
He should have insisted they shut that system down, but I think they figured, well, we got to have it on. That's one thing I never did.
Is work on like a hot.
I'm not going to work on a live circuit.
Yeah, no.
I remember one time.
That's a hell of a risk.
Yeah. I mean, when I was in the Navy one time, we had to go up and do some repairs on the radar tower. And one of the NCOs says, well, are you going to go up there? I said, not while it's raining. Hell no. Come back tomorrow and talk to me. What I got to do is not that important. I'm not going to take my life.
Yeah, and water and electricity is not good friends. You know what I mean?
Well, my dad was an electrical engineer, brilliant guy, electronics engineers, brilliant guy, but also one of the clumsiest men you ever met in your life. I mean,
oh gosh,
you don't give him a hammer, he would hit himself somehow. And when he was like 15 or 16, he was in a shop class and he cut off a finger in a lathe. And when I was a kid, the whole time growing up with him, whenever we were working on something, whenever I got clumsy or careless, he would just hold his hand up and say, hey, you want this? Okay, message received.
Scare you real quick, yeah.
So,
tape you up.
So I was always very careful, and that was one of the things. Like I used to work at heights quite a bit, and people go, well, aren't you scared of them? I said, well, I respect them. Let me put it that way. If I'm going to be up there, I'm going to be very secure, and that's
Hell yeah.
But yeah, when that one accident, And it turned out the breaker box, it was faulty cables. There was moisture
Oh,
in the cable that we'd used. So it was nothing we had done. It was just something that happened. But yeah, when I saw that, I said, yeah, maybe God is sending me a message here that it's time to get out of this gig.
yeah, man, because it almost seems like it's only a matter of time before you
Yeah,
get
and that
that huge shock,
was
so
the
to speak.
conclusion I reached, is like, the longer you're at a job like that, the greater the risk of an accident and the greater the accident will probably be. Because
Right.
you're complacent, you get cocky, and that's just
Yeah, absolutely.
so. Yeah, I started, and that's when I said, okay, time to go back to school and listen to my friend for after 4 years of her, yelling at me to go back to school. I said, okay, it's time to go. But so anyhow, so yeah, then I started school and ended up now doing writing books and teaching and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about you and getting into writing books. What kind of led you down that path? Now, it sounds like you always had a passion for writing and stuff because you wanted to, do
I
journalism and stuff.
did,
So,
yeah, and I always kept journals. In fact, it's funny, I still have papers from like 1970s. Drive my wife nuts, and I'm convinced I'm going to be able to use them someday, so I keep them around.
you're gonna be the next episode of Hoarders, man.
There you go. Yeah, well, not that bad, but I don't know if you can see that big black box behind me is a 4-drawer file cabinet just filled with papers and stuff. Uh, but and that's mine. And but actually, when I went back to school, my original intention was to major in history because I'd always had an interest in it and always enjoyed it. And growing up, part of the Cold War, and by the way, that's one of the things I always emphasize. People go, "Well, were you a Vietnam vet?" I said, "No, I was a Cold War vet." I didn't get close to Southeast Asia, and thankfully for that.
Right.
Uh, but having grown up in that period, I was very interested in that. And then I got into one of my first English classes, and there was the professor I had just liked what I was writing. He looked at my stuff. He says, and so it's funny. He and I have actually become very good friends. He's still out east. He's in North Carolina now, but it turns out he was from Boston area. I'm from New York. We were actually only a year apart in age because I started back at school. I'm in my mid 30s at this point. And we had both spent the same year in Baltimore and had actually hung out at a lot of the same places. But the first thing he did was says, look, we just started a school paper. I'd like to get you on. He says, I would like you to be the managing editor because you're older, you know how to, keep books and get stuff done and that sort of thing. Most of these guys are younger and I don't mind them being in the editorial stuff, but the managing is the guy who runs the business basically. And I'd like to get you in there. And I sort of pushed him off. I said, look, I was interested in that once, but not anymore. He says, well, there's scholarships involved. I said, oh, you didn't say that.
Now we're talking.
Now we're talking. Yeah.
Right.
So I ended up, and it was great too, because that led to a job through the college, which I could do on my own time pretty much, paid very well. And I was actually able to quit. Well, I didn't quit the job at the retirement home. I ended up getting laid off because they changed owners and they laid everybody off and we're starting over. So by the time the layoffs came, well, I was already comfortably in these other spots, and then actually picked up a side gig publishing a small arts and letters newspaper in the town. Didn't pay a lot, but paid enough, and also acted as kind of an open door to a lot of places in town because it's like, okay, press credentials can get you damn near anywhere. So I started work for the school paper. Well, then this guy also was very big on poetry. And so he started roping me into helping him he had a literary festival every year, and he, got me helping there. But it was funny because the poetry was the first thing I started writing. And trust me, if you had come to me 35 years ago and said, you're going to be writing poetry, I would have laughed at you, said, you're nuts. I have no interest in that. Well, what happened was the school newspaper went on a convention, and there was a workshop on how to improve your writing. I said, "Oh, let me check it out." And the woman who gives the workshop just gets up there, and the whole workshop was like 10 minutes. She says, "Look, you want to improve your writing in anything, try writing poetry, because it's such a disciplined art form of writing. You really got to know how to be economical with language, how to pack everything in. It teaches you to cut out the fat and all that stuff." And so I got, that weekend I wrote my first poem, and since then, well, I've published 4 books now of poetry. Uh, so yeah, I got into that. But at any rate, of course, that took me off of the history track. And initially, I wanted to study linguistics because I figured, well, study the history of the language, that would give me the writing and the history at the same time. But then I transferred from the community college. I went to Central Florida, who had the best linguistics department in the state that I could see. But the problem was, once I got there, I realized, no, this is their linguistics program was more for if I was going into speech therapy or teaching ESL or something like that. I was like, this isn't my area of interest. So I ended up going into literature, but also did creative writing. So when I got out, I had a double major in lit and creative writing. And it's funny because at the time, this is going back to the early 90s, there was a literary movement called the New Historicists, which most of my teachers were part of, and I consider myself part of. And it basically held that you can't, and I still teach from this point of view, is you can't study any art form without knowing what was going on at the time the thing was produced. That, when you're reading something from the 1800s, well, what was going on politically and economically and socially and historic, everything that all ties in. And, in fact, the example I love to use, I say, look, Christopher Columbus would not have been able to make his voyages were it not for 2 pieces of technology at the time, the compass rose and the second.
Right.
Because unless you can guarantee you're getting me back to port, I ain't going with you.
Yeah.
So yeah, what happens all around also determines what happens. So that, and this sort of held that, or you can't just look at a piece of writing as just a piece of writing. You can't look at it as a piece of writing from this particular writer, but what was going on around the writer at the time that might have affected the viewpoint, and what goes in, what stays out, and that stuff. So that kind of pleased both ends of me, being a one-time history buff and still a history buff, and then the writing part. So, and then, got my degree. And that was when I moved to Puerto Rico because I got involved with a Puerto Rican woman in Orlando. What a surprise. I was a Puerto Rican in Florida. But we got serious. Well, while we were dating, she got diagnosed with breast cancer. When I graduated, she says, look, I'd like to go home. I said, oh, hey, I'll go anywhere. I don't care. And so I moved down there. She only lived for another year, but I stayed down there for 2 years. Well, I was here again. I'm getting jobs teaching. I'm doing my master's. You're asking a New York City kid to live in the Caribbean full time. What's not to like? And then I ended up out here when I met my wife, who's here. When we got involved, she said, look, do you mind moving, to California? I said, look, the only reason I was there is gone anyway. And to be honest, nothing against Puerto Rico, but I'm a little too Americanized
Yes.
for that pace of life, especially being from New York. So yeah, so that's when I ended up here. It was 96, came up here in 96, 97. So that's sort of the thumbnail of my life. But yeah, the writing was always sort of in the back of my mind, but it really didn't come about until the late 80s, early 90s.
Right now, so what inspired you to write your books, and talk about the different books you got and what they're all about, and kind of what led you to write that book?
Well, let's say the poetry stuff is just as I built up collections that seemed to fit.
Was it like the romantic type poetry,
Oh
like
no,
love
no, it's
poetry
actually
type, or was it funny? Was it like
when I was at UCF, my undergrad years, they used to call me the blue collar poet because that's what I write. I said, look, you write what you know.
right, right, right.
So a lot of it is, yeah. I write a lot about music. I love music. So, in fact, one of my books is called Music Speaks, and it's a short collection of poems, starting with classical, going mostly through jazz. I'm a big jazz fan. Um, and so that I did have one that came out a few years ago called This Just In, which is subtitled A Poetic Journal of News Stories, Fake or Otherwise. Uh, and I kind of geared it toward a newspaper and had illustrations in it and that sort of thing. Um, my first book and my last book, the first one was A Former Life, it was called. And the last one I wrote was called Just a Little Cage of Bone. And both of those are sort of, especially the last one is, look, I'm in my 70s. I'm looking back at life at this point. And so it's mostly recollections of family, friends, experiences. Uh, Not that there aren't sort of love poems in there. In fact, I always like to say my first real love poem was a poem written about a girl I was dating, her grandfather. I read a story. He had a newspaper interview, and I read about this guy. I said, man, you got to love this guy. He was an old farmer who had retired and then become a carpenter, and just he was such an interesting character. So I always said, yeah, my first love poem was about an old retired carpenter in Iowa. Uh, but no, mostly I write about, you know, hanging out in bars and diners and stuff like that. A lot of music, a lot of my family stuff too. I mean, both my parents have since passed on, so there's a lot of that showing up. Uh, it's funny. I do write a lot about religion, even though I'm not particularly religious. It's, but I would say, you know, read the Bible. The material there is so good. How can you not write about it? So, uh, in fact, in my last book, one of the poems is called "Crashing the Apostles' Cocktail Party." Uh, Sort of what might it have been like to go to a mixer, after
Right, yeah.
the events of Easter. Uh, but yeah, the poetry is generally I just catch images or get thoughts or impressions. I'm really big on keeping journals or diaries, whatever you want to call them, and using those notes to take off on things.
Now, you had someone teach you how to write poetry, or it just came to you kind of naturally,
Well, no,
I
I
mean,
still, geez, I mean, here again, that guy, that Kevin that I met at
because it
junior
is very
college.
intricate. It's not, it
Yeah, but I'm part of a weekly, we get together on Zoom and it's a workshop of poets. And, we just, like, we send our stuff out a few days before the meeting and everybody looks everybody else's over. And we get like about a 20-minute dive into our own work. And I really appreciate those. And there's another one I hit sporadically, but not as much as I'd like to. It's funny because they tend to have theirs every other Sunday, but it seems to be on the Sundays when my wife and I are both big Dodger fans and we get season tickets, and it always seems to be
always the
home
Dodger
game. So
games.
it's like,
Yeah.
sorry, I can't make it this week. We're going to the game. Uh,
Right.
Baseball, Uber alles. And that's shown up too. I wrote a poem about Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Uh, I've written several on baseball. Uh, I wrote one. It was funny. It was a poem about the racetrack, the betters at the track, uh, and I had to laugh because there was an Irish publication that took it and published it. It's an online thing, and somebody came in and said, "Finally, somebody writing about the guys laying the money down." You always read about the horses and the jockeys, and nobody ever gives any love to the betters.
Yeah, I bet that would be that is
Yeah,
interesting because the different personalities and stuff that
yeah,
go in there, and what makes someone even bet on a horse or
yeah. I know.
why. Like, I would like to. I know I've always wanted to just go to one just just to check a mark. Like, oh, I did
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Yeah, it's one of the well, I've never, I don't gamble a whole lot, and I've never
Yeah,
that. Uh, I mean, certainly if I went, I would probably throw some money down, just to make it
just
fun.
for the experience.
Yeah, but in fact, it's funny. My dad, he owned a couple of businesses in Las Vegas. I mean, he was out in New York, but he ended up taking over a business in Vegas, and then ended up as opening his own.
Sounds very mafioso.
Well, this is what's funny is my wife now, when she first met my dad, she told him, she said, "Oh, Bill said you used to go out to Las Vegas all the time." He said, "Yeah, I had some businesses out there. I took care of it." He finally he closed up shop. It just got to be too much for him flying cross country every few months to keep up. But she said, "Well, did you ever gamble when you were in Vegas?" He goes, "Oh, I gambled all the time and I always won." She goes, "What do you mean?" He says, "I built the slot machines, man. I'm the house." You mean, did I bet my own money? No. You think I'm nuts?
Yeah.
but
Oh, that's great.
anyhow, yeah. But that's, I write about a lot of different stuff, just things that, you know, uh, for example, my latest poem is, well, I wrote one about my son, but I've been working on that, the notes on that for some time. But I wrote one about, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Pan's Labyrinth, because I'm a big movie buff too.
Yeah, yeah. That
Well,
moves
if
as
you
well.
remember, Mercedes is the housekeeper in the movie. And I always said, man, she's a ballsy character. Remember, she's the one who cuts the captain's mouth wide open.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
she's like, "You think I'm the first?" What's her line? You think I'm the first? You're the first pig I ever gutted. Well, I like this girl. So I said, yeah, somebody should give her some attention. Uh, but yeah, so there's just a lot of different things. You never know. Now, fiction wise, I did write a book of short stories, and some of those come out of my time at the military. Uh, I did just write a memoir, actually, which I need to work on, about my time in the Navy and then at the shipyards afterwards. But that needs a lot of work. It's a few years away from being presentable. But I wrote this one book just before this one, The Heroic Brothers, was just a collection of short stories about my own life, uh, starting when I was like 6, 7 months old, something I heard about, from my parents, and then on up to the last story deals with our son is very severely disabled, so it's about being the parent of a disabled child. This is when he was much younger.
Right.
Uh, it's just kind of a collection of short stories. Uh, you know, Meeting Captain Kangaroo and having a beer with Captain Kangaroo. It's
Oh, yeah.
stuff
Dang.
like that. Just like
Nice.
little
Okay.
things that happen in my life.
That's funny. All right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of them, it's funny because here again, I and you could probably relate to this one. I'm not comparing my high school to the Marines or anything, but we were getting ready for one of my reunions, and my wife said something about, "Did they have bullies when you were in high school?" I said, "It's a military school. It's built on bullying. That's the whole
They're
point."
all bullies.
It's like, yeah,
Who's the biggest bully?
yeah. And that was the story I wrote. It's called "Bully You Betcha." It's like,
Yeah.
that's the, and it was funny because at that reunion, I remember we were talking to one of the 10th graders there at the time, and just how different it had become. I mean, we graduated in 70 or 69, 70. Um, yeah, how the school had changed over 40 years. And the kid goes, "Did you notice any racism while you were here?" Because we were just trying to get through the day, man. We didn't have time for that. Racism is a luxury. But yeah, but that's, here again, that collection of stories. And then, of course, this one, The Heroic Brothers, which was kind of in honor of these guys were both my eighth cousins. And I've been writing about them. Well, I grew up knowing about William, obviously, the guy in the Navy, because that's who I was named after. Uh, But then Alonzo, I don't know if you heard about him, but back in the 90s, somebody started a campaign to get him the Medal of Honor. And he finally got it in 2014, I believe. They finally gave him the Medal of Honor. And the more I read about him, I said, boy, both of these guys are interesting because they were both very devoted to each other, but they were very completely different personalities. And both made their mark very much on the Civil War. It's hard to say which one made the bigger impression. Because Alonzo died at 22 at the Battle of Gettysburg. William, of course, went on to live a little longer, enough to join the fleet and go to Asia and stuff like that. But both of them made, a really big mark. And I think the fact that, I always point out with Alonzo, I mean, you figure getting the Medal of Honor 150 years after the event, that is a rare thing.
Yeah, no kidding.
You got that time limit.
Exactly. And people still thinking about it or talking about it.
Yeah. And so that was, so I was part of that. And so probably about 5 years ago, I started reading up on these two guys more and more and gathering notes. And that's what produced the book itself, which, is a very pared down book. I don't know if you got a chance to look it over, but it's only 50 pages. So it's not very long, with illustrations too. So, in fact, that's
perfect for Marines then. Goodness.
I never talk trash about Marines because one of them is actually a very good friend of mine from Valley Forge. In fact, we just at his house on Friday night. He had a big party.
Outstanding.
But yeah, well, I always like to say we were the Uber drivers.
That's for sure. They're definitely our taxi.
Yeah. But of course, I always love the what is it? We will fight with each other, but the minute somebody from the outside tries to interfere.
Yeah, exactly. It's like cousins, we're cousins fighting, and then someone else wants to get involved. Like, who's this? Let's all be.
I think it's funny. The only time I ever came close to an argument, it really wasn't a fight or anything, but it was when I was in the Navy, and I went out and I was at a bar, and obviously, I mean, here again, you're talking the early 70s. It was pretty easy to pick out the military guys back then.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And I'm at the
haircuts.
bar. Yeah, we were the ones with the haircuts. But this guy sits with me, and we start talking. Well, he's in the Army. I said, well, I'm in the Navy. And he goes, Army's better. I said, look, man, it's all the same shit as far as I'm concerned. You got to put up with your stuff. I got to put up with mine.
Did he agree with that?
Yeah, he was like, okay, yeah.
I surprised. Like, what?
Was if you were looking to start a fight with me, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I'm not going to fight you over which service is the better.
Right.
That's why we have the Army-Navy game anyway. So
let them settle it.
Which, unfortunately, Navy has not been doing very red hot on.
No, they really haven't. I know. I usually go for the Navy too, since I'm the Department of the Navy.
Well, that's Well, it's funny because we usually, and there's a lot of Valley Forge graduates, alums in the area, and we'll usually get together, on the Army-Navy game. And, some of
that's
us.
fun. Yeah, that's cool.
Army, a couple of Air Force guys.
There's nothing like military banter. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And just, hanging out with people that don't get sensitive, and you can have a good time with them, and without it being overly like stepping on eggshells when you're
talking. I don't know what years were you in? Did you
2000 to 2004.
Oh, okay. Then you were probably before. Because I don't know if you ever heard of Gary Roughhead, was the CNO.
I'm not sure.
I think he came in 2010. But he was a year ahead of me at the school at Valley Forge. And when I heard him announced as a CNO, I was like, not a big surprise, because even as a cadet, he was one of those guys.
Squared away.
Yeah. He went to Annapolis, and but he was one of those guys you just looked at and said, yeah, he's going to go far. But you know, but anyhow, but yeah, as far as the writing goes, right now, in fact, I just got through, I got to polish it up, but I just finished a short story about the Normandy landing. Um, I've written several. I did one of the stories that I really enjoyed writing was about the Trojan War, uh, but it was from the point of view of basically the grunts. Yeah.
Now, do you go and do a lot of research about all this stuff and prior to doing it to kind
I
of get yourself set, or do you already kind of know
If
a
I'm going
lot
to
about
write
history?
something based in history, I'm going to check it out to have at least a shred of accuracy.
Sure, to
You
get
know,
something in your
yeah.
yeah.
Like this book, I had to. I ran it by a few people that were Gettysburg experts or Navy experts and said, "Look, is this looking right?" And they would give me some nice feedback and say, "Yeah, no, it's, this or that, or you're right on there." But most of it was just reading up, uh, on the two guys as much as possible, and just talking with people who are really dedicated buffs. Uh, like the Trojan War thing, about the only thing I looked up was, all right, what was the layout of the city of Troy? You know, where was the Gate of the Lions? Where was this part? Where it's just so I could get the geography right. But it's pure fiction in and of
Right.
itself, so
Right.
it really didn't matter. Uh,
Well, I guess that's the kind of the nice thing about fiction, huh? It gives you a little bit more.
yeah, you got the leeway to,
Right. Yeah.
but I want to make sure that the language is right. That like well, this last story I wrote about the invasion of Normandy, and I wasn't even thinking at the time. I just put RPG in the thing, and one of the guys in my writing group said, "Well, they didn't have RPGs then." Good point.
Right. Yeah.
I need to just it was the first term that came to mind, and I threw it in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
That's why, here again, you say, how do I teach? I get heavily involved. I mean, I'm in the one writing group on Thursdays is for mostly fiction, nonfiction. And then the group on Saturdays is poetry. So I get input on ongoing stuff pretty steadily, which, yeah, I think when it comes to writing, well, I always love one of the things I tell my students is writers are never satisfied. They just give up. Eventually say, I've looked at this enough. I'm tired of looking at it. It's going the way it is.
right.
But but I do
Now,
enjoy it.
what's that?
I do enjoy the writing. I think.
Now, if someone wanted to look at your books, look at your work, where would you send them to go
Well,
check it all out?
everything is on Amazon.
And we have
But
this.
yeah, I also post them on my webpage, the My Writer Online. That's mostly like interviews like this and reviews and things like that. Amazon, I know a couple of them you can get a sneak peek, how they will show you the first few pages. Uh, and then I'm also, a lot of times people can just put my name in.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you put poetry, it'll take you to sites where where
All
my
your stuff is.
online, or if you put short stories, uh, you know, like that kind of thing. Or if you just put Bill Cushing writer. Now there's several. Bill Cushing is not an unusual name.
No, yeah, I Googled it. Yeah,
Yeah,
for
there's a
sure.
bunch of us out there, and
There's some.
several
Yeah,
of us are writers.
yeah.
By the way, when I first started getting involved, just for the fun of it, I put my name in on YouTube and saw what came up, and there was a cross dresser named Bill.
Oh yeah.
I ain't the one. That's not me. I disavow that one.
He's like,
I was like, oh,
yeah.
great. Somebody puts my name in and what comes up. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
But there are, people can go to YouTube, and if they put Bill Cushing, here again, poetry, or it's funny, I collaborate with a musician on occasion. He bounces between here and New York. So whenever he's out here, we try and get gigs together. And we've made our own YouTube page, which is called Notes and Letters, where he plays music and I read my stuff. That's been a lot of fun. It's funny because he and I actually grew up across the street from each other. And then when I went in the Navy, well, by the time I got back to New York, he was already out here, I think, or in school, whatever. But we just didn't see each other for like 40 something years.
Wow.
And I did a reading and I found out he was in LA. So I wrote him. I said, hey, why don't you come out to the reading? And he goes, and afterwards we sat down and we were talking. And he says, well, what do you think of this idea? Why don't we get together? I'll improvise some music and you can read your stuff. And I just told him, I said, Chuck, here's your problem. You never ask a poet, does he want to read his stuff out loud? Because the answer is always going to be yes. So remember, you started this. It's all your fault. But I've been doing this now since 2016, I guess.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Now, is there a certain poem out there, or is there a certain piece that is your favorite that you have out
Of
there?
mine?
Yeah, right.
I think probably actually one of my favorites is the first one I actually wrote, which is called In Pink Neon. And it's about an all-night diner, which
Nice.
and just to tip you off, if you ever see it, I was trying to channel Tom Waits when I was writing the thing, who was one of my favorites. But no, it's hard to say. I mean, I've been pleased with several of them. I did the one on Miles Davis. I thought came out very well there. In fact, that's gotten a lot of good play. I've had that published several places. It actually won didn't win. It got nominated for a push card. It didn't win, but I did get a nomination for it.
Nice.
So yeah, that one was a fun one. But yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I've written several. One I wrote about my mother and my sister right before my mom died. I'm really pleased with that one.
Do you have a number of how much stuff you've done in general, or
Oh God. In the poems, I easily a couple of hundred. Some of them, obviously in progress, not, they're not finished yet. But you figure, well, the first book has 90 pages. The second book is about 90 pages. So that's about 80 there, figuring some go more than a page.
Sure.
So, yeah. I mean, I'm not one of those who's, I've written 1,000 poems. I think that's counterproductive. I would rather, in fact, it's funny because when I first started writing the poetry, there's a bar I used to go to in Jacksonville. And one night I was there and the bartender says, oh, you got to meet this guy. He writes poetry too. You guys will get along. Which I've never understood that mode of thinking. It's just because I share a particular activity with somebody doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to get along with them. But
right, yeah.
But I asked the guy, I said, well, what's your process when you're writing? When do you think it's done? He goes, oh, well, I just write it the first time and it just comes out the way I want. And I'm thinking to myself, well, you're either full of it or you have the lowest standards in the world because, I can't think of it. I mean, the Miles Davis poem is about as close as I got to a single writing. And not to say it didn't go through changes, but the base of it was pretty much, which is kind of interesting because it was right after Miles Davis died. I locked myself in my room with all my Miles Davis recordings and a bottle of bourbon and just started writing notes, which I say attests to the inspiration of either Miles Davis or bourbon. I don't know which one. Take your pick. But that one came out pretty much the way it is now with some changes, but nothing major. Most of the time my stuff goes through massive changes 4 or 5 times easily before I'm close to what I want, which is why I think, whenever I hear somebody start going about, I got 2,000 poems, doesn't mean
what's
I want
the quality of that, right?
Yeah, I don't want to wade through all 2,000 of them, that's for sure.
Yeah, because I imagine some of them are just really quick thoughts, and some of them are probably great,
fine,
but
but this idea of keeping a head count is, I don't care for that. And all the good poets I've met during my life, and I have had the chance to meet some pretty big names, including Gwendolyn Brooks and Carolyn Forche, these guys are top tier. And all of them say, no, you're never satisfied. You just keep editing, revising, and that stuff.
now,
really
So what's the future hold for you? You got any big time goals? You
Yeah.
know, or what is the future
Well,
got for you, Bill?
last year, or the beginning of this year, I finally finished up a memoir about my late wife, and I'm going to start dedicating more time to getting that in publishable shape. So I'm hoping by, well, it's May now. I'm hoping by the end of this year I have it ready to send out, and then I'm going to get back to the memoir of my own about the Navy and my time afterwards, because that it's far too long. It's just it needs to be cut by about half. It's just
Oh, you went a little
I
too
just went
into
nuts with
detail
it,
or so. Yeah.
and then I'm just going to slowly cut stuff out and throw it away, and which is really the way to do it, I think. I mean, that's
Well, it's probably better to have a whole bunch and be able to scale back than
and then
then you,
just
you write 5 pages and you're like, goodness gracious, I
well,
don't
yeah.
know what else to write anymore.
When I teach writing, I always tell my students write more than you need because it's always easier to make it shorter than to make it longer.
Right.
So,
So now talk a little bit more about teaching. What got you in there, and you know,
I
you
always
teach
well,
writing and stuff like that. Is that what you're in?
here's something I've always said: most people who teach, if they hadn't gone into teaching, either would have become either ministers or stand-up comics. So you can take your pick which one I am, but it's like my friend back in Jacksonville said, you love talking about this stuff. You obviously you enjoy, and that's one of the things when I teach. I love teaching critical thinking. That's one of my favorites. But I'm supposed to have a literary analysis class this semester, this summer. Officially I'm retired. I retired in 20, but I still teach a class now and then. But I'll teach like freshman comp. But I love teaching the critical thinking, which is where I go into, like we read Thoreau and Martin Luther King and Orwell and stuff like. I even have some Desmond Morris in there, who's the biologist who writes about human behavior. Uh,
So do you do a lot of reading yourself, or are
oh
you
yeah,
more of the writing side, or do you like both?
no,
You
I
just love
love reading.
literature in general? Yeah.
I usually have 2 or 3 books going at one time. Uh,
Goodness.
yeah, I'm right now. I'm finishing up. A woman I met, and she gave me a copy of her book. Well, I bought it from her, but she signed it for me and stuff. But it's something I need right now because she wrote about her sister who died of cancer. So it
Hmm.
kind of getting me back on track with that. But I've also been reading. It's been a fun read. It's a book called, I can't remember the guy's name who wrote it, but it's called Miss Lucy, and it's about Bram Stoker. Because remember, in Dracula, Lucy was the woman that Dracula was obsessed with. And so this is a kind of a fictional biography of Bram Stoker. Uh, so you can sort of tell where the guy's taken off on his own, but also there's a lot about his family life and himself and that sort of thing. So those are the two I'm reading primarily now. And then of course I get the stuff in from the workshop, so I'm always reading that. Like one woman she's just finishing up, I believe, a fictional piece about Mount Vesuvius and Pompeii. Another woman's wrote a thing about what do they call them, the Japanese mafia. Uh, I can't remember the name they call them now, but she wrote a book about that. Uh, so it's interesting seeing these other people. Uh, One of the guys is a big horror writer. I'm not a big fan of it, but I figure, well, I can help out a little bit. But that's really not my market.
Right.
But probably my favorite writer is Anthony Burgess when it comes to novels, the guy who wrote Clockwork Orange. Uh, but yeah, I love his stuff. Uh, so during the pandemic, I must have read about 4 of his books in that time. And he's not an easy read. He's one of those guys. He's pretty dense, but he is interesting and really a master of the language. I mean, that's what I like about him. Just the way he handles language is just astounding. I guess you can compare him to Tom Brady. Uh,
That's what's interesting. I think about a lot of writers too is the way they write and
yeah,
articulate their stories, or the way they perceive or see something.
yeah.
All
Well,
those
he's
type
one of
of
the
things.
few. I mean, here again, I focused on American writing. I'm an American. That's
Right.
those are my people.
Sure.
Vonnegut, John Gardner, those guys. But yeah, Burgess to me, geez, I read his stuff and like if I could come close to the quality, and then you look at the quantity that the guy produced. It's like not just writings, but translations and critical studies and stuff like that. So, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, is there any last thoughts or anything you would like to say before we head out? I really
Well,
appreciate you coming on, man.
yeah, I hope people might be interested in looking at this book, The Heroic Brothers. I'm really proud of it. I thought it came out very well. If they want to look at my other stuff, fine too. And certainly if they go to the website, they can get to me through the email there, or you can also email me at the email you got, the Pisces Poet. Is probably the most reliable. I've got several other emails, but that's the one I go to probably the most. But yeah, I'm really happy with this book, and I was really pleased to get Walt Lord, General Lord, to do the introduction to it. That was a real nice coup for me, because the guy he was a cavalryman, but it's nice to get somebody of his stature to look it over.
Heck yeah. But all right. Well, once again, I thank you so much for coming on, Bill, and telling your story. Talking about what you got going on. We'll be in touch for sure. Once again, like I said, thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for your service and all that good stuff. But
although, like I say, the one thing I love when I first got on Facebook, one of the first guys I connected with was a shipmate off the Beery, and I sent him a note and I said, "Is this the same guy I served with on the USS Beery?" And he wrote back immediately, saying, "Well, if you can call what we did service, I guess so." I was like, "Yeah," because this guy was the prankster on the ship. I mean, he was
love it. Yeah,
he was something else. What was funny with
the comedic relief?
Oh yeah, and what was funny with him, he looked so innocent. He was a short guy, kind of pudgy. We used to call him Qantas because remember the koala bear on the Qantas commercials.
Yeah.
So he looked like a little teddy bear, and he was the
great.
devious guy I ever met. I was like, I would not want to upset you ever. Anyway, but thanks so much for giving me the time.
Hey, thank you so much again. All right, Bill. Appreciate you. All right, friends and fam, that's going to wrap up another great interview. Once again, if you guys would like to go check out his books, his poetry, his poems, go check it out. mywriteronline.net. Again, that's mywriteronline.net. Also, hey, go pick yourself up a copy of the Heroic Brothers of the Civil War. Go check it out. You know what I mean? It's not a long read, so if you're a Marine, pick it up. All right. Well, I hope you guys are having an amazing day. You know how I say, don't let the day kick your ass. Make sure you're out there kicking the day's ass. We'll see you guys on the next one.